Good morning, gardeners, and welcome to Friday, May 5th. Don't worry, this show has nothing to do with actual gardening, so don't run away if you're like me and can't grow green things. I'm speaking of gardening metaphorically. We're planting the seeds for a better day, we're cultivating a better life for ourselves, better communities, and a better world. Today is African World Heritage Day, which offers an opportunity for people around the world to celebrate the world's second largest continent. Some of the biggest threats facing Africa include climate change, uncontrolled development, disease, civil unrest, and poaching. Because of the threats facing this diverse continent, it is more important than ever to protect and preserve their heritage. You can celebrate African World Heritage Day by reading about famous historic sites in Africa, learning about African heroes, or donating to a charity that is working towards solving the problems Africa faces. If you need a charity recommendation, I recommend GiveWell.org, a website that finds the charities that save or improve lives the most per dollar. Today is also World Password Day, which is every year on the first Thursday in May. It is an opportunity to revisit your password habits. Remember to use long, unique, and complex passwords that are stored offline and never reuse a password for multiple accounts. So, as I told you on previous mornings, I have been listening to myself speak every morning and using this show as I intended, which is as a sort of focal point in your ears every morning to wake you up, help your brain get moving, and help you get focused on the right things. Essentially, I want you guys to use it to prime your mind to do your best each day. But this morning, I chose not to listen to myself. If you listened to yesterday's episode, which I didn't, but as I recall, I think I was essentially complaining about how uncomfortable it is to listen to my own voice, and I've been doing it for nearly 2 weeks now, so, I figured I deserved a break. Do you ever get that feeling, after you've been doing a good job, say you've been, working out regularly, you've been going to bed on time regularly, or you've just been, whatever good goal that you have in your mind that you feel like, okay, I need to do this in order to make progress, to be a good person, to be productive, whatever it is. After you do that for a while, a voice comes up, a rebellious voice. It's like the inner rebel, and it's like, no, not today. Sometimes you just get sick of doing what your brain tells you you're supposed to do. And I used to fight this voice tooth and nail. I used to resist that voice with every fiber of my being because I thought, I need to be, honestly, I thought I needed to be perfect. I had this crazy high standard for myself, and I thought, every day counts, every minute counts, and I was so hard on myself, and I would not give myself a break. And of course, I'm sure you can guess what that resulted in: burnout. So these days, I tend to listen to that voice whenever it comes up, and it doesn't mean that I'm never going to listen to myself speak again. It doesn't mean that I can't continue an effort for a long period of time. It doesn't mean I can't achieve goals or complete projects or anything like that. It just means that I now give myself more permission to take breaks. And honestly, I think it has made me more productive in the long run. So today, I let this voice choose the topic of Good Morning Gardeners, because this voice came up for me not only this morning, but actually yesterday morning after I spoke with you, when I began reading Deep Work by Cal Newport. So let me just read to you what I was reading, a section of what I was reading yesterday. This is in the introduction of the book. And maybe you can guess why this inner rebel started speaking up after I read this. So, the deep work hypothesis. The deep work hypothesis is that the ability to perform deep work is becoming increasingly rare at exactly the same time it is becoming increasingly valuable in our economy. As a consequence, the few who cultivate this skill and then make it the core of their working life will thrive. This book has two goals pursued in two parts. The first, tackled in part 1, is to convince you that the deep work hypothesis is true. The second, tackled in part 2, is to teach you how to take advantage of this reality by training your brain and transforming your work habits to place deep work at the core of your professional life. Before diving into these details, however, I'll take a moment to explain how I became a devotee of such depth. I've spent the last decade cultivating my own ability to concentrate on hard things. To understand the origins of this interest, it helps to know that I'm a theoretical computer scientist who performed my doctoral training in MIT's famed Theory of Computation group, a professional setting where the ability to focus is considered a crucial occupational skill. During these years, I shared a graduate student office down the hall from a MacArthur Genius Grant winner, a professor who was hired at MIT before he was old enough to legally drink. It wasn't uncommon to find this theoretician sitting in the common space, staring at markings on a whiteboard, with a group of visiting scholars arrayed around him, also sitting quietly and staring. This could go on for hours. I'd go to lunch, I'd come back, still staring. This particular professor is hard to reach. He's not on Twitter, and if he doesn't know you, it's unlikely he'll respond to your email. Last year, he published 16 papers. This type of fierce concentration permeated the atmosphere during my student years. Not surprisingly, I soon developed a similar commitment to depth. To the chagrin of both my friends and the various publicists I've worked with on my books, I've never had a Facebook or Twitter account or any other social media presence outside of a blog. I don't web surf and get most of my news from my home-delivered Washington Post and NPR. I'm also generally hard to reach. My author website doesn't provide a personal email address, and I didn't own my first smartphone until 2012. On the other hand, my commitment to depth has rewarded me. In the 10-year period following my college graduation, I published 4 books, earned a PhD, wrote peer-reviewed academic papers at a high rate, and was hired as a tenure-track professor at Georgetown University. I maintained this voluminous production while rarely working past 5 or 6 p.m. during the work week. This compressed schedule is possible because I've invested significant effort to minimize the shallow in my life while making sure I get the most out of the time this frees up. I build my days around a core of carefully chosen deep work with the shallow activities I absolutely cannot avoid batched into smaller bursts at the peripheries of my schedule. So, like I said, yesterday I just read only the introduction to this book, and I agree with the premise. It seems sound, it seems very well researched, and I think that the idea of deep work is an extremely useful idea, and I'm looking forward to learning more. However, did that intro section, just that part of it, make anyone else feel some kind of way? Like maybe inferior, or maybe even just tired of the grind and the constant pressure to be better, to produce more, in the face of, these amazing, impressive MIT people. We have all of these impressive people with their impressive credentials writing impressive books, and it really is enough to give a person an inferiority complex. So for our feel-good moment, I am going back to Psycho-Cybernetics to read to you what Maxwell says about the inferiority complex. If you don't feel like you have an inferiority complex, that's totally fine. I don't really either, but just apply this toward that feeling that you may or may not get of inferiority. The person with an inferiority complex invariably compounds the error by striving for superiority. His feelings spring from the false premise that he is inferior. From this false premise, a whole structure of logical thought and feeling is built. If he feels bad because he is inferior, the cure is to making himself as good as everybody else, and the way to feel really good is to make himself superior. This striving for superiority gets him into more trouble, causes more frustration, and sometimes brings about a neurosis where none existed before. He becomes more miserable than ever, and the harder he tries, the more miserable he becomes. Inferiority and superiority are reverse sides of the same coin. The cure lies in realizing that the coin itself is spurious. The truth about you is this: you are not inferior. You are not superior. You are simply you. You, as a personality, are not in competition with any other personality, simply because there is not another person on the face of the earth like you, or in your particular class. You are an individual. You are unique. You are not like any other person, and you can never become like another person. You are not supposed to be like any other person, and no other person is supposed to be like you. So I'm sure that you have heard that sentiment before, but I just really, really like the way that Maxwell phrases that here. And, not only do I think that is a great thought, our feel-good moment today, but I actually think that this is not just something that you can use, not just a thought that you can use to make yourself feel better, but also a thought that you can use to make yourself or to help yourself perform better in life. So the idea of competition for me is kind of tangled up in the idea of having goals and wanting to create things, wanting to produce value for the world. Personally, I have a very deep desire to produce value and to create things. But the feeling of competition or having to compete with so many amazing, just impressive, it just strangles me. And it, as we spoke about yesterday, it feeds my perfectionism paralysis as well. So it's really counterproductive. So in this episode of How Many Books Can I Read From on One Morning, I am going to crack open yet another book. This one is 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel. Now, for the record, I am not a fan of Peter Thiel, but I am reading this book because it's about startups, and I often work for startups. While this book is full of problematic assumptions and unfounded claims, I think that what Peter Thiel has to say about competition is absolutely correct. He argues that in a competitive marketplace, innovation is stifled because every company is too focused on what every other company is doing. He calls for startups to cultivate a monopoly through innovation, creating products and or services that are so valuable and or unique that no one else stands a chance to compete. And he cites Google and Apple as examples of this kind of monopoly. Now, however you feel about encouraging the existence of monopolies, and believe me, I understand that it is extremely problematic to say the least, right now, I only want to focus on Thiel's condemnation of competition. He says, the competitive ecosystem pushes people towards ruthlessness and death. And more than anything else, competition is an ideology, the ideology that pervades our society and distorts our thinking. We preach competition, internalize its necessity, and enact its commandments, and as a result, we trap ourselves within it. even though the more we compete, the less we gain. This is a simple truth, but we've all been trained to ignore it. Our educational system both drives and reflects our obsession with competition. Grades themselves allow precise measurement of each student's competitiveness. Pupils with the highest marks receive status and credentials. We teach every young person the same subjects in mostly the same ways, irrespective of individual talents and preferences. Students who don't learn best by sitting still at a desk are made to feel somehow inferior, while children who excel on conventional measures like tests and assignments end up defining their identities in terms of this weirdly contrived academic parallel reality. And it gets worse as students ascend to higher levels of the tournament. Elite students climb confidently until they reach a level of competition sufficiently intense to beat their dreams out of them. Higher education is the place where people who had big plans in high school get stuck in fierce rivalries with equally smart peers over conventional careers like management consulting and investment banking. For the privilege of being turned into conformists, students or their families pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in skyrocketing tuition that continues to outpace inflation. Why are we doing this to ourselves? He goes on to say, professors downplay the cutthroat culture of academia, but managers never tire of comparing business to war. MBA students carry around copies of Clausewitz and Sun Tzu. War metaphors invade our everyday business language. We use headhunters to build up a sales force that will enable us to take a captive market and make a killing, but really, it's competition, not business, that's like war. Allegedly necessary, supposedly valiant, but ultimately destructive. My dog just yelped in her sleep. All right, continuing with Thiel. Why do people compete with each other? Marx and Shakespeare provide two models for understanding almost every kind of conflict. According to Marx, people fight because they are different. The proletariat fights the bourgeoisie because they have completely different ideas and goals, generated for Marx by the very different material circumstances. The greater the differences, the greater the conflict. To Shakespeare, by contrast, all combatants look more or less alike. It's not clear why they should be fighting, since they have nothing to fight about. Consider the opening line from Romeo and Juliet. Two households, both alike in dignity. The two houses are alike, yet they hate each other. They grow even more similar as the feud escalates. Eventually, they lose sight of why they started fighting in the first place. And that, to me, illustrates perfectly how damaging competition can really be. Now, if it wasn't already obvious, I am drawing an analogy here between individuals and companies. After all, companies are made up of individuals. And I believe that competition on an individual level is at least as destructive as it can be for businesses. So for today's focus moment, I want you to think about what Thiel says about how destructive competition is, and then try to merge that idea with what Maxwell says about competition. You are not in competition with any other personality, simply because there is not another person on the face of this earth like you. I want you to ask yourself, honestly, if you truly believe that deep down in your core, do you really believe that you don't need to compete with anyone because you are a unique individual? And then observe the answer without judgment. Now, if you do believe it, great. Now ask yourself if you are really acting like you believe this. Try and seek out any little competitive habits that you've built up and come up with at least one way to replace these habits with non-competitive ones. And if you don't believe it, or if you have doubts, ask yourself why. Why don't you believe that you don't really need to compete with anyone? It may be that you've observed the winners and losers in society and how the winners always seem to be better at competing. Maybe your mind goes immediately to the animal kingdom or the various examples of competition in nature, like how crowded plants compete for the sun. Or maybe you just struggle to believe that in the sheer vastness of humanity, each individual is truly unique, let alone special. Now, these are all understandable thoughts. I'm not going to argue with you about these thoughts. I'm going to move on to a next set of questions. I want you to think of one person that you love dearly, like your child, brother, sister, niece, or nephew. Do you believe that this person is worthy because they are unique? Or do you believe that this person needs to work really hard to compete to earn their place in society? Observe the answer without judgment. Finally, ask yourself the following questions about your current deep down beliefs on this topic. Is it helping me to continue believing in the same way? Are my current beliefs making my life better or worse? And are my current beliefs making the world a better place or a worse place? Personally, in a world of limitless possibilities, I would prefer that future generations not have to worry about competition to survive. Competition for fun is great, but competition to feel like you deserve to take up space or deserve to make a living is destructive. On that note, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will speak with you again tomorrow.